Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 117, Silver Screen Sports, Individual Glory.
That's right. It's entry number 2 into our sports series, which has mostly been dad movies so far. But we have one today that isn't a dad movie, and I'm interested in that.
And it'll transition us into the final episode in this series, too, pretty well, I think.
Yeah, we have one as well that is definitely Oscar bait, and one that's kind of an underdog story, both in how it was made and in the movie itself, like the story of the movie itself, with a nice bit of synergy that makes it one of the most well-known and well-beloved movies of all time. But let's list the actual movies we're going to talk about today. Up first is Rocky from 1976, directed by John G. Avildsen, although nobody knows who that is. Not to be terribly rude, but that's not a name that rings a bell. But obviously the number one person associated with this movie is Sylvester Stallone. Everyone knows he wrote it himself. He starred in it himself. There's a big story behind that, and we'll get to that when we get to the movie. But
John G. Avildsen actually directed The Karate Kid, apparently. So he's not totally under the radar.
Not totally under the radar. That fits, though. That sounds very 70s, 80s blockbustery, so that makes sense. But this movie did clean up at the Oscars with a whole ton of nominations and 3 wins for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Editing. And again, those nominations were Best Actor, Best Actress, 2 nominations for Best Supporting Actor, Best Screenplay, Best Sound, and Best Original Song for the song Gonna Fly Now, which I believe is the song that is played during the montage, the Rocky music, the Rocky theme.
Getting stronger.
Is that what they sing in like a really high-pitched late 70s voice?
Yeah, they say
Gonna fly now.
Yeah, but all the lyrics are so on the nose that when I was rewatching it, I was like, oh yeah, wow. How did this song become so popular? Because it's kind of cheesy.
This isn't every man's movie, Jonathan. And we will get to that. That's not a bad thing. It's just made at a level of accessibility that we typically don't see with a lot of movies that become
I love how we have
both for their quality and their popularity.
Yeah, I love how we have 2 movies this week that are both quintessentially American in almost diametrically opposite ways.
Oh, super opposite. And then, of course, next up we have Chariots of Fire from 1981.
This one is not quintessentially American, by the way.
No, this is so darn British. It's it's so preppy, Jonathan. Anyway,
it is.
Chariots of Fire from 1981, directed by Hugh Hudson. It won several Oscars, obviously for Best Picture, Best Screenplay, Best Costume Design, Best Music, and it was nominated for Best Actor, Best Director, and Best Editing. And this is kind of that point in time when we're getting out of the 70s, when stuff would win Best Picture like The Godfather, and into the 80s when stuff would win Best Picture like Chariots of Fire and Out of Africa, and everything that was super, kind of floaty and 80s and soft. And it's when we start to get into the Oscar bait, which was episode 8 of the podcast.
Yeah, very early.
But it marks a big transition, and we'll talk all about that today. It's got a very different feel. And then finally, of course, we're going to talk about The Writer from 2017, one of the most recent movies we've ever covered on the show, directed by one Chloe Zhao, who I've been looking into her career. She's very new, so she hasn't made too much. But what she has made is really good. She's actually working on a new movie right now, Jonathan, that's a retelling Western of the first African-American marshal in the American West. Which is really interesting because she's from China and grew up in China and then went to school in New York and is now obsessed with the North American West. Which is just fascinating. But The Writer's a really good movie. I'm really looking forward to her next effort, and I'm really looking forward to talking about The Writer today. Because while it fits into the same category of individual sports that the other 2 do, it feels like it approaches it in a very different manner.
Yeah, very different take.
But without further ado, let's jump into the individual breakdowns of each movie, starting with Rocky from 1976. Jason, take it away.
Rocky from 1976. down-and-out boxer Rocky Balboa tries to live his life in a way that proves to himself and everyone around him that he's more than a bum. As he begins to romance with Adrian, who works at a pet store down the street, Rocky is given a chance to fight the undisputed heavyweight boxing world champion, Apollo Creed. Apollo wants to put on a show, but Rocky is ready to go the distance.
All right, Alex, I think we're going to need a montage.
Yeah,
I'm just gonna lead with that because we got to get into it.
I think this might not have been the first movie to do montages, but without a doubt, this is the movie.
Montage goes back to Soviet Russia.
Yeah, so that's a theory of montage, right?
Right.
But this, when you tell the person who hasn't gone to film school montage, this is what they think of.
I feel like I learned in film classes about montage through Rocky. Like Rocky almost reinvented the definition of montage.
Yeah, this is what everyone knows about. This is what that Phineas and Ferb song is about. Remember that show? I love that show.
Blast from the past, Alex.
One of the reasons it works so well in this movie is it's a complete groundswell. All of our sympathy is with Rocky. They do that over the course of the entire movie. They make sure we know he's a good guy. He's nice to everybody. He's like he's kind of a bum. Well, he's a bum, but he's like a gentleman. That's part of the bum.
Thing, yeah.
He's kind to everybody. He's
a bum with
hard.
A heart of gold.
You can tell life has kicked him around. And he never reaches either. I feel like that's a big part of his appeal too. Like the opportunity in the movie comes to him.
Yeah.
But he's just looking for his own little slice of happiness. He just wants to date the woman at the local pet store. He's not going out after like some unattainable supermodel.
Yeah.
He just wants to fight his fights until this opportunity comes along. And even when he's approached by them, he's just like, oh, you just want me to be like a trainer. You want me to be somebody he can fight to warm up. And so we have all this sympathy for him, and then suddenly we see him working out. It's very straightforward. It's very clear. It's very understandable. And of course, with the music and the cutting and the sympathy on our side, it becomes so darn exciting and so damn rootable and supportable by the audience that it clearly, has won its way into like the American psyche iconic. Of what movies are. Yeah. This is why everybody knows this movie. Even people who never watch movies know this movie. And it's for that reason. But the shocking thing to me about the montage and the fighting, Jonathan, it composes a very small portion of the actual movie. A lot of the movie is spent on character drama and character building.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of just kind of figuring out who Rocky is and seeing how much of his time is spent, just with the people around him and the various impressions that other people have of him. Like even just Adrian's arc of going from being very off-put by him because he's kind of just a gruff guy on the exterior, and then slowly warming up to him to being his biggest cheerleader. That's probably 50% of the movie right there. And then, we've got all the... One of the things that I was picking up on this time that I never really thought about too much is there's actually kind of a connection between Adrian and Creed in the way that they both present a foil to Rocky. Because kind of what the biggest contrast in the film is between the idea of brains and brawn, I think. And they create that contrast with Adrian because... they have the line that says it explicitly where he's like, my dad told me I was never going to be very smart, so I better start using my body. And she's like, well, my mom told me I was never going to be very beautiful, so I should start using my brain. So they set up that dichotomy, but then they also have the same kind of thing with Creed, where Creed is a smart fighter. He plays smart. And we see that, most of his fight is PR. It's not even about the fighting. He spends so much time like crafting a spin for the fight that he doesn't even, spend any time. We don't see Creed train at all. We just see him show up in his Uncle Sam outfit, ready to put on a show. And so there's that contrast with Rocky just, having to overcome just by kind of brute force and sheer determination of will that is kind of presented in both the love interest and the antagonist, which is really interesting.
Yeah. She actually ends up being a rather fleshed out character, which is not super common until rather recently. That happens for a lot of love interests in films,
especially ones that aren't like presented that way. Like this is a guy's like, we're gonna see some dudes hitting each other kind of movie.
Yeah, this is definitely a dude movie. But yeah, and I think one of the reasons that they keep the fighting down, well, two things. One, fighting scenes are fun, but putting too many of them in a movie can kind of drag.
Especially if your actors aren't actual fighters.
Yeah, that too.
That gets hard.
It can get a little repetitive. Plus, it just works so well as a climax that you typically just want to save it till the end. You've got your ending. Just put it there and mostly leave it out of the rest of the movie, because everything else can be put in reference to that final moment.
It's like the shark.
Yeah, and then the second thing that it kind of allows for in this movie is that this movie isn't really about the fight. The fight is just kind of this, and the training is just kind of this expression of Rocky tackling all of the challenges he's faced in life and the kind of person that he is and wants to be and wants to try to become, and dealing with all of that kind of mixed in. That's what he's really doing when he's fighting up there. He's not really fighting Apollo Creed. Yeah. He's fighting everything life has thrown at him. And we have to understand that by seeing him over the course of the movie. And then maybe, like thing 2.5 we could throw on there, because I already mentioned it a little bit, is the whole sympathy quotient. You have to spend that much time with the character in such a sympathetic light that you root for him across the rest of the movie. Because if you don't, then it's just a fight. And sure, it's a David and Goliath fight, and that's always appealing, but it's more appealing when you work up that sympathy. And I will point out this caveat, because I'm going to sound like a hypocrite if I don't when we get to Chariots of Fire. They build up sympathy for him in a very fun, non-dragging way. Like the scenes between him and Polly and Adrian, where he has to go on the date, they're all entertaining. They're all fun. They all move. They don't feel like a drag to get through. And if this is kind of like a foreshadowing of how I'm going to talk about Chariots of Fire, so be it. But yes, just because you have to build character and sympathy doesn't mean those scenes should be boring. All scenes should be interesting.
Yeah. And the other thing is, like, well, again, we'll build this contrast, but even the political, PR spin angle is entertaining. But along those lines, like as far as the final fight being more than just, Rocky fighting Apollo, it's interesting that they build that up within the movie too, because Apollo's whole spin is that he's fighting for the American dream, or he's giving some, lowly American a shot at the American dream, a shot to go from zero to hero, kind of a deal. But he doesn't even take it seriously, because Rocky ends up actually fighting, for that dream. He fights with his whole heart. And, Apollo's like, I just kind of wanted to do a show. I wasn't expecting to like actually have to fight and defend myself. But, Rocky takes it, and he's fighting for all of these things that make up the American dream, which gives him the drive. And that's another thing that really goes into that we're going to see across these individual sports is the motivation for the sport, and how that has so much impact on the outcomes. Like, why are you doing this? And the more motivation you have on top of your physical, literal skill, that is almost a majority of what it takes to win.
Certainly. And Jonathan, let's talk about the making of this movie real quick, because that is an interesting story in and of itself.
Oh, yeah.
And it's something that a lot of people know, but just in case you don't. So this movie was actually written by Sylvester Stallone in about 3.5 days, which, for the record, this is a fact that gets thrown around a lot whenever anybody talks about this movie for some reason, and I'm guessing it's because Stallone mentioned it a bunch in interviews at the time. 3.5 days is not an absurd amount of time to write a first draft of a movie. That's honestly pretty common for a lot of writers or people who are extremely motivated to bang out a rough draft in 3 days and then spend months and months rewriting it. But anyway, he wrote this film in about 3 days after watching a Muhammad Ali fight where he just freaking devastated some guy. Absolutely brutalized him. And Stallone was not really working as an actor at the time, but he was part of a essentially East Coast Actors Guild of some sort. I think it was called the FTA. That it was shopped his script around, and some people actually picked it up. They liked it. They really wanted to make it. And this actually happened multiple times. People wanted to make this movie. It seemed good. It seemed fun. Obviously it was. But there was a problem. Sylvester Stallone wanted to be the one to star in it. And everybody else didn't want that. They thought it would be a good star vehicle for someone like Robert Redford or Ryan O'Neal, who we saw in a lot of Bogdanovich movies like What's Up, Doc and Paper Moon.
Oh, yeah.
Burt Reynolds.
Gosh. Given
or
What's Up,
James
Doc,
Caan.
I could not see him in this movie at all.
Yeah. And we're gonna get to that, but they essentially wanted to star, and they were offering Stallone at this point like hundreds of thousands of dollars, lots of money. And Stallone was so poor at this point that he even like sold his dog for like $50 to some dude in a liquor store, because he was just so broke. But he would not say no, he would not say yes unless somebody agreed to cast him. And eventually they caved, because one of the great things about writing the script that you want to make is that you own it. So he does. He leverages it. He takes like a paltry like $35,000, which sounds like a lot, and it is to somebody who's down and out. But in terms of buying up blockbuster scripts, that's a pittance. That's not a lot of money. So anyway, he buys a script. It gets made. It's a huge hit. He has to go back and finds the guy after waiting outside the same liquor store who sold him, who he sold his dog to, and he wants to buy it back. He offers the $50, no deal. Offers $100, no deal. Keeps on racking up the price until he ends up paying like $15,000 to get his dog back from this dude. But he got his dog back, so that was nice. But here's the question, Jonathan. I think this movie works best with Stallone in that lead role because he is an everyman, especially at this point in his career where he's literally a nobody. The way we see Rocky as a bum in the fighting circuit, kind of how Stallone was in the acting circuit. He was a bum. He didn't have any big leading roles. He barely had enough work to feed himself. Yeah.
Not to mention, like, he, as the originator of the script and the story, like, he's so invested. Going back to that motivation, he knows what the character is feeling. He knows that this is basically his shot. This is his fight with Apollo. It's his shot to make it big. I mean, just looking at his IMDb page, he has like 10 or 15 like little kind of throwaway credits right before Rocky. And then, you know, Rocky is the thing that just skyrockets him. And there's the only person who understands that feeling at that moment is Sylvester Stallone. Like Robert Redford, Ryan O'Neal, Burt Reynolds, they're already there. They're already Apollo. So sure, they could play it and do it well because they're great actors. But Sylvester Stallone, like, you can really see inside his head. Like, there's so much character development just through his performance that is coming from a really real place as he's doing the film.
I think Robert Redford could have done a really good job in this role, but I think we would remember this movie differently. I think it would have been successful, but I think we would have remembered it as a Robert Redford movie. And I think there always would have been this disjoint that you feel looking at somebody like Robert Redford, this handsome Hollywood actor, super successful, in this bum role. Something would have felt off about it. But one of the big advantages of having Stallone in there is that he is the everyman. he is the bum. He fits the role. And what's more, he is such a nobody at the time that he becomes a star off the movie, but it doesn't become that Sylvester Stallone movie. It's the Rocky movie.
Yeah.
It doesn't get overshadowed by his own star power. So Rocky,
I'm sure there's still lots of people who don't even realize that Stallone wrote the film.
Oh, probably not.
Yeah.
I'm willing to bet. But
because it stands alone. It stands on its own. But
this movie ends up being so accessible and popular that, I mean, people who don't even realize that movies are written and not just made up by actors on the spot probably have seen this movie.
Yeah.
But yes. Anyway.
Yeah, it was so funny because, again, like just going back to this movie after a while, I had this weird sense of Sylvester Stallone having baby face, which is a feeling I never thought that I would have because he's such a kind of just imposing guy in general. But it's so funny to see him now, you know, still the star character in so many movies, but he's just gotten like more and more gruff, I feel like. And so you go back to Rocky and you're like, oh wow, Sylvester Stallone looks tender. Wow.
Yeah, no, it's strange. I remember when I first saw this movie as like, you know, a 10-year-old or something like that. I thought he looked so old, like all 10-year-olds think all adults look. But yeah, especially compared to like something like The Expendables, which is much more recent, it's definitely got that baby face going on here.
I think we should bring this up just because it's important as in terms of like a sports movie is the fact that he loses, you know? It's kind of a big deal.
Because it's not about the fight. It's about the fact that he went the distance.
Yeah, which is another thing that, you know, when we're getting down to it, talking kind of generally about sports, the way that they get approached, and especially underdog stories, you know, underdog stories are almost, by definition, the underdog has to win, but not always. This is one of the big exceptions, is the fact that he kind of won. He won. He got the goal that he was going for, but it's not necessarily a victory in literal terms with the sport. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of these individual sports and the way that they can still be a feel-good movie and not a tragedy, even when the hero loses.
I think that's another reason why Rocky's so successful. It's not about the winners. It's about the losers.
Yeah, it's about the fight.
All right, then. Let's move on to Chariots of Fire from 1981. Jason, take it away.
Chariots of Fire from 1981. Leading up to the 1924 Olympic Games, Eric Liddell and Harold Abrahams prepare to compete in various track events. Liddell, a devout Christian from a missionary family, runs because he sees it as glorifying God with his talents. Abrahams runs to overcome the subtle but persistent anti-Semitism he experiences in daily life. Both are challenged physically and morally while getting ready to face off in the most prestigious athletic competition in the world.
All right, Jonathan. So before we get into the meat of this movie, let's start off with what the significance of the title is. And I'm guessing you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know specifically, but it's a biblical reference to Elijah having not died, but being taken up to heaven on a chariot of fire. But they didn't actually bring it up specifically in the movie. Do you know if there's like a really specific
There
connection?
isn't a specific reference, but I think I know what it's about. I think it's about obtaining a certain amount of freedom or release or ascendancy through the act of running. And that's actually, it took me a while to realize what the meat of this film was about, but it starts to feel like it's about both of these runners essentially creating a level playing field for themselves within society by through the act of running and through the act of being good at running too. And this is something we hear about today, where people who are of certain groups who might not be valued by the society at large on their own can create that value and temporarily erase the labels that would otherwise disadvantage them in day-to-day life through becoming successful at athletics. So that I think that's one part of it. And the other part of it is that both of these people seem to enjoy running so much that it becomes nearly like an act of piety in itself to run.
Yeah.
Now, one is definitely running towards religion, and one is running away from religion. And they're both kind of stuck in this system that seems fairly hypocritical to me, because one is Jewish and, essentially suffers from not being Christian, like waspish enough in Anglo-Saxon England in the early 1900s. And the other is literally too Christian for the system.
Yeah.
Like, his problem is that he's too pious, and everybody else, while paying lip service to that piety, is actually put off by this person who actually, backs up what he believes. So one is essentially running almost as like a form of prayer, because he believes that's what, God has put him on earth to do. And the other is essentially running away from the prejudice that society has placed on him for being Jewish.
Yeah.
And that is actually like a really interesting concept for a movie. It's just a shame that the rest of the movie is so darn boring. Oh.
Yeah, it's kind of it is a character study, and I think that a lot of this goes into...
It's kind of a character study.
A lot of it goes into motivation too, because the bits that I was picking up is that there's an element of the fact that Abrahams is running for himself and like to prove himself constantly stresses him out. And so he's great, and yet there's so much pressure that he's putting on himself that it almost feels like he's never like quite enjoying it just for its own sake. Whereas Little is running for kind of a higher purpose. And so he just kind of runs for the enjoyment of it, and yet not so much that he's going to let the sport overtake his values. So there's a lot of values and stuff like that. But there's also, it just kind of like, I didn't realize how much of the film was going to be focused on Abrahams, because I knew the general premise. I knew about like Liddell and not, or Little. I always want to say Liddell, but it's just literally Little.
It's Little,
and how he wouldn't run on Sunday. But it's really Abraham's movie. Like, honestly, I wouldn't even call this a two-hander. I think Little is there just really to be a foil to Abraham's.
Partway through. I feel like, so here's the thing. I really love the core concept of this movie. It's a really cool idea. This is a biopic. It's based on real people. It's could be really interesting. It's really meaty.
It feels like it's almost
flub it.
Yeah, it feels so close to being like a really good David Lean character study, and yet there are just enough moments that are a little too clunky or a little too sugar-coated that it misses that mark a little bit.
Yeah, and you know what? You're right. It is a character study, but also it kind of like loses sight of that for large portions of the movie, where we just focus on like plot.
Yeah.
Or like the entirety of like the first 30 minutes of the movie, where nothing happens except they kind of kick around the Oxford or Cambridge caption or campus.
Yeah.
And there's like a little bit of character stuff in there. The tiniest bit.
That sets up Abrahams, and it sets up how good he is, because he does this thing that no one's done in 100 years by running around the courtyard, and it sets up his friend too, which I just kind of want to throw this out there, because technically the film has like a narrator in Abraham's friend, but Abraham's friend is so inconsequential to the story that I forgot until like 3/4 of the way through the film, when he pops in to say something in voiceover, and I was like, oh yeah, this is from someone else's point of view that I still don't even know who this person is. So yeah, it gets kind of lost on some of the things that it's aiming at. I mean, granted, it's kind of like a big thing as far as trying to encompass the Olympics and like some world politics and prejudices and stuff like that. But still, it didn't feel completely cohesive.
It hews very far into like biopic Oscar bait safe mode, where it's like, look at all this costume design, look at these cool settings, look, we're going to hire somebody to create a synthetic soundtrack, which I hate.
I will say the Scotland landscape, you know, that kind of eases some of the boringness. Just like it's so
really
beautiful.
It's really beautiful. I don't think any of the scenes are ill constructed. It's not greater than the sum of its parts. It creates a bunch of stuff that essentially succeeds in individual categories at the Oscars and plays it so safe that it becomes like a Best Picture bet. It's a prestige picture generated by a studio specifically for that reason, it seems, while kind of hewing away from the actually interesting parts of the story, which is just really disappointing. And one of the things I started off not liking about this movie, but I liked by the end, was all of the running in slow-mo. It makes more sense in slow-mo by the end after you see that what running means to each of these characters. Yeah. It just took so long to get there.
And it's like it starts so early. Like, I mean, the very first thing is the running on the beach, the non-diegetic scene, which I guess is a thing. Where they have the scene of them all running on the beach, which is just for the film's purposes of putting them all together. But yeah, the slow-mo running is so interesting because I think there are a couple of times when we see Abrahams in races, like in montage, like training things, where, you know, it's normal. But I think every single time we see Little run, it's in slow motion with those synths going on. I was not expecting the mix of like heavy 80s synths and like just traditional English hymns and folk songs and stuff. It was such a weird mix. The music did not age well.
Literally just sing a song about how English they are.
Yeah, the song was "He is an Englishman," which was to create a contrast, of course, about Abraham's not like being an Englishman and yet feeling like he's treated not like an Englishman.
Kind of not being an Englishman at the same time. Or being an Englishman and not being treated like an Englishman. It makes sense, but also... They could have done all of this with like cutting 30 minutes off of the runtime.
Yeah. And if there's any film that like it kind of calls for a more natural, non-synthetic soundtrack, is probably this one.
Yeah, the synth soundtracks, and this is something we've talked about before ad nauseum. The soundtracks in the 80s just did not age well.
Yeah.
I mean,
except for John Carpenter's, they still work.
So anything that's synth kind of fails. It depends on what you're going for. Though, and this is something that's risky a lot of times when you do period pieces, and you decide, let me use a modern soundtrack.
Yeah.
That works for maybe 10 years after you've made the film. Like it ensures that the film isn't going to age super well. Because suddenly all of the references you're making that are really germane to the time don't make sense anymore. And this isn't an argument that you need to make a movie that stands the test of time. Like your goal in making a movie shouldn't be to reach an audience 100 years from now. It should be to reach the audience now. But relying on trends to do that is typically not the path to hyper success.
Yeah.
Or essentially generating a classic.
Yeah, so I guess the last thing to kind of get into is the actual Olympics when we get there. Honestly, I started to get...
I always check out by that point in the movie, but continue.
I started to get kind of confused about like what race we were running. I think I honestly had a problem.
There's a lot of weird politics about like who's running what race.
Yeah.
That also like kind of like nullify, like it almost was like a Deus Ex when that one guy came in and was like, don't worry about not wanting to run the race on Sunday. I'll run the race on Sunday.
Yeah. I've run plenty of races. You can have mine.
I'm like, way to avoid having the character make tough decisions. And you know, that might have been what happened because it's a biopic.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it is. Like that, it seems kind of hard to mess with, you know, who ran what race at an actual Olympics. But it also kind of ends it. It's not a very dramatically satisfying way to do it. I mean, obviously it's hard to argue with the reality, but I was waiting this entire movie for Little and Abrahams to run a race together, and they ran one race together at the very beginning, and then there was no dramatic payoff to that.
Yeah, no, it's very strange. It felt like it could have been better if they'd focused on one or focused on a period of time where they interacted more.
Because it feels like they should have focused completely on Abrahams, and they almost do, but they spend just enough time on Little to make it feel like they were trying to make a two-hander, but leaned it too heavy on Abraham's side, and then you're just really not sure exactly what the focus was. So yeah, it was trying to do a lot of things, and again, like, it's a good movie. It hits a lot of the
I would say it's well put together.
Yeah,
but looking back on it, it's as a cohesive whole, it falls a little short of good for me.
Yeah, but it's going for like this really a feel good tone. It's going for a lot of, putting your values into the things that you do and the things that you're good at and holding to that. And it gets all that across. It's just not the tightest or most entirely compelling way to do that. That's my diplomatic way of putting it.
That's fair. This is a very diplomatic movie. That's actually kind of the problem, Jonathan, is that it just kind of uses in between lines so hard, not wanting to commit to anything, that it doesn't end up feeling that important after all.
Yeah.
You kind of get to the end of it and you're like, oh, well, I guess I watched a movie. I can kind of say what it's about, but they didn't really address it.
Yeah. It was kind of, just as a sidebar, it was kind of interesting to see some of the characters from our World War II series show up whenever he literally has a conversation with the king and the two princes that were in, like, the King's Speech and, all the British movies about World War II. And, he almost won't have an audience with the prince because of his infidelity, and yet he still goes in and has that conversation. So there's that whole thing that it was just interesting. It's such a tiny part of this movie, but we spent a lot of time on it earlier in this season and other movies, that it was cool to have that kind of just pop up again.
All right, Jonathan, anything else to say about Chariots of Fire from 1981?
No, let's move on to The Rider from 2017.
All right, let's get on to The Rider. Yeah, Jason, take it away.
The Rider from 2017. After suffering a major head injury in a rodeo accident, Brady Blackburn is torn between his passion for the rodeo and his own safety. He is influenced by his family to quit and use his talent with animals for horse training, but also feels pressure from his friends and community to cowboy up and get back in the rodeo again as soon as possible. Brady must ultimately decide what parts of his life are the ones most worth living for.
All right, Jonathan, I know I hadn't seen this movie before. I don't think you had seen this movie before.
I had seen this movie before. It's why I put it on this list. Yeah.
I loved it. It's a very good movie.
Oh, yeah. It's super good. That's why I was like, I got to watch this movie again and throw it in with some of these other sports movies, because I think it fits, but it just fits very differently.
Yeah. And it's, it's about a sport that isn't commonly thought of, but rodeo. Mm-hmm. But it also, it addresses some interesting ideas that are present in other sports, like, cost versus benefit on an activity that kind of destroys your body.
Yeah. If not your life, then your future, potentially.
Yeah. And it reminded me a lot, actually, of The Wrestler.
I still haven't seen that one.
Yeah, it's very similar in a lot of ways. About a person who's essentially so committed to the sport, they've slowly destroyed their body. Mm-hmm. I would say The Wrestler kind of errs more towards showing just how graphically this guy's destroyed his body, and through that kind of getting to the almost like mental addiction he has to this activity, or like the problems in his other parts of his life that make him retreat to this activity. But here we kind of focus more on like the mental effects of being deprived of that activity, of what it means in this guy's life and what being away from it is. But I actually want to get to one thing real quick before we get into it. This movie actually reminds me a lot of the French New Wave, Jonathan, and Italian neorealism, and that's because
I was thinking bicycle
director
thieves,
Chloe Zhao used non-actors. She was actually making another movie on a Native American reservation at the time when she met a guy named Brady Jandreau, who actually stars in this movie, who is not an actor, but was rodeo rider who, these are real events. He hurt himself. He had received such a bad head injury that he wasn't able to ride rodeo anymore, and he had difficult recovery, both mentally and physically. And he's cast, and then a bunch of other non-actors from the area are cast as well.
His family, his dad and his sister are his real dad and sister, which is... Yeah. So this is one of the things that makes this film... I mean, this film treads a line between fiction and documentary.
This is definitely art imitating life.
Yeah, in a way that's super interesting, because there's almost not a way to make this movie quite as detailed as it is without feeling like it's overwhelming or pushing if these weren't real things. Like the fact that his sister has autism on top of everything. The fact that, just the random characters, like the guy with the hook for a hand, and like, stuff like this that you almost can't think up when you're focusing so much. I know, but it's such a real thing, and yet a thing that you don't come up with when you're creating this really like slow dramatic story. Like, sure, you can come up with quirky characters, but the fact that these are just the people around him, the people that he actually knows, and just like all their quirks and all the things that they do, like so many of these scenes just felt so raw. Like when he's just in the living room and he challenges his friend to wrestle as like a pride thing, regardless of his head injury.
That's exactly how my cousins act, by the way. That was so funny when that happened. I was like, oh, it's like I'm in Portland right now.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, it feels real. And then there's the emotion that comes after that, and stuff like that. Like, it's actually incredible that all of these, I think they're all non-actors, because they all pull off. Like, there's sometimes when there's a quality of non-actors that just feels really kind of like awkward on camera. And there are moments of that in this film, but in the whole, there's so much just genuineness. Yeah. I think it's also because all of these non-actors know each other. So it's not like there's an uncomfortableness.
Pre-established relationships. Yeah. So it's a mixture of pre-established relationships, and then obviously just good direction, like making people who are non-actors comfortable in front of the camera is an art in and of itself.
Oh yeah.
Non-actors can sometimes really overact or really underact. It's difficult. But obviously it all pulls off really well. Here's a question for you, Jonathan. You kind of mentioned this before. Is this really a narrative movie? Or is this just like a reenacted documentary? Like reenacted, dramatized documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I think...
Is it somewhere in between that we just don't have a word for?
Yeah, the thing is that it's not like anything in the film really constitutes like a
true
plot.
Reenactment.
Well, yeah, it's not like there's a story that has been created, because so much of it is kind of slice of life. So really, it's getting at a truth, this journey that he went on, as far as having an injury and having to come through this entire mental process of giving up the rodeo. And that's kind of amorphous enough to just kind of, the all the things with his horse training and stuff like that. These are all true things, even though they didn't happen like in this order. And yet there's never really like an emphasis on the order or the plot or anything like that. So it's hard to say that it's fiction. It's not documentary in the sense of we're just going to follow him around and, talk to his buddies and get all their stories. Although there are moments that feel like that, like the campfire scene. And yet it's not really a narrative in like, then Rocky had to train and then he had to fight Apollo and this one last thing. It just all feels like something that could have happened, although it didn't happen exactly this way. Although we're not really saying that it did, because it doesn't really matter what order all these things happened in necessarily.
I also love how much I can feel this movie, Jonathan. Like, one of the things I love about movies is how you're able to communicate, and this is for all art really, how you're able to communicate something that is understandable by humans but can't really be spoken in plain language. It requires something like poetry or a long novel or a carefully made film to come across, like the certain longing that this lead character has, knowing that to be apart from the thing he loves is so suffocating that he might just die, but to participate in the thing he loves might also kill him.
Yeah.
And that is something that comes across. But even just getting down to like the minutia detail, like the first early on in the movie, he's out in the morning with his horse. And I could feel how cold that morning was, and like the wind on the plains. Just something part of it was honestly the color, the way it was shot, the naturalistic slice of life style of a documentary that almost immerses you in the moment. That just makes it a very experiential film.
Yeah. And I think another thing that kind of goes into that, again, on a thematic level, is just because I think this film can be extrapolated to kind of be about anything that has kind of defined your life to all the people closest to you that you know that you need to move away from, or that you're trying to move away from. And yet so much of your identity is wrapped up in that. So just the constant element of his friends or the people in the town saying like, hey, I hope you get better. You can get back up and start riding Broncos again and, doing the rodeo thing again. And yet he knows that he needs to get away from that, but it's kind of being forced down his throat. Like, this is who you are. This is who everyone knows you as. So how do you redefine yourself away from that? And the difficult part of that, but that can be applied to anything, really.
Yeah. No, it's and actually I feel like the experience of the sport in this movie is very similar to the experience of the sport in Chariots of Fire, where riding has essentially become like a source of like freedom and almost like a source of like an ascendancy, where you feel like you're becoming a better version of yourself or a truer version of yourself, or just getting lost in the moment maybe. But just the act of doing the sport in and of itself becomes something to be desired so much that it kind of ends up defining the entirety of the character.
Yeah. And there's a pride thing too. I mean, the other pressure that comes from his friends is, if he doesn't get back up, then he's weak, or, then he's not a real cowboy or whatever. And yet I think one of the things that the film shows is that it takes just as much strength to walk away as it does, maybe more than it does to just keep doing it, regardless of the consequences. And
definitely. Speaking
of the consequences, we have to talk about Lane, because Lane is an essential part of this movie.
Love that character. It's such an important part of this.
You can't even say
movie.
Character, because Lane Scott is one of the only ones. Well, actually, a lot of them kind of just go by their actual names. I think the Gendros, or however you say it, are the only ones who actually changed their last names for the movie for whatever reason. But yeah, Lane is literally just Lane, and he's so important.
He's a super important person. And I like him because he's essentially there. If you're looking at it from like a plot perspective, plot construction, character construction, motivation construction, when you get into the gears of a story to make it tick and function, he's there as like this source of foreshadowing. He's a warning. He's what might happen to you. But in reality, he's a full real person. Mm-hmm. And in the movie, he's very clearly a full real person. And clearly, he's suffered. But his life isn't over either. And you can see him actually, he has this fully fleshed out relationship with his friend. He still experiences and lives to his fullest.
Yeah, he jokes and,
every day. Yeah. But at the same time, it's very evident that he's still functioning like that. He our lead goes in there, and now I'm getting confused. I can't remember which one his real name and which one isn't.
Just Brady. Brady is his real name in both.
It's Brady Gendreau and Brady Buckner?
Yeah, in the movie it's Blackburn.
Blackburn, that's it. Blackburn. So yeah, when Blackburn visits him, it's you can tell what he's thinking.
Yeah.
Like, this might be me. This could be me. Is this worth it?
That moment, I think the second time, after they do the physical therapy on the little fake saddle, and then Brady is driving home, and I can imagine that, Chloe, the director, probably just mounted a camera in the car and said, drive down the road and, just experience it, because that emotion on his face is so telling with no words. It's him. And I think that Lane also presents this, he almost enables us to see this really foolhardy kind of delusion that some of the other cowboys have, where every time they talk about Lane, they're like, yeah, can't wait for Lane to ride again. Can't wait for him to get back at it. He was so good. He was one of the best. And then you see Lane and you're like, he's never going to ride again. Like, they're suppressing it intentionally.
Yeah. You can also definitely tell, part of that's that when you do something that dangerous, you have to tell yourself that lie.
Yeah.
In order to continue doing it. Because it's not like Brady is the only one who's risking death every time he goes out there.
Essentially all the characters are facing the same decision every time they go out. It's just that Brady basically got off easy. He could have easily been Lane with the last injury.
Yeah, the illusion of invincibility that young people convince themselves of has already been shattered for him. And we're in a way dealing over the course of the movie with him reckoning with that loss of innocence, that blissful innocence. And he realizes, oh crap, all of my actions here have consequences one way or the other. Either I'm going to have to deal with all of this mental anguish, or I'm going to have to deal with physical anguish and possibly death. And the mental anguish might lead to death as well. He's seriously, like, you can tell, like, it's not just that he really wants to ride. You get so much of the character experience, and you can see how much it hurts him to not be able to ride.
Yeah.
So he might be able to make it, but it's not going to be an easy journey to get there.
And yet he doesn't do this. He doesn't do that thing where I feel like a lot of movies like this, he would have 3 or 4 scenes where he's just kind of yelling, this is who I am. This is, what I do. I can't not do this. And there are moments where he says, like, a cowboy's purpose is to ride. And if I don't have that, then what am I?
I love that it hews towards something that's a little more realistic.
Yeah, but he almost never says it too. Like, you get a lot of it, a lot of the movie is just Brady being in various circumstances that tug him one way or the other. When he's with his dad, he's getting the don't ride for, your safety and your family's safety, when he's with his dad and his sister. And when he's with his friends or other people in the community, it's ride because, this is what we do and this is what people look up to you for, like that moment with the little kid in the supermarket and stuff like that. And so it's like every scene kind of tugs him one way or the other. And so we are on this roller coaster with him, trying to figure out what is the best and the smartest thing to do, even if it's not, the coolest or the safest thing to do, depending on which way you're kind of leaning, depending on what scene we're in.
It's also, and something else that's really impressive about this movie, Jonathan? You could look at this movie and look at the facts of what happened scene by scene and say, this is going to be a really slow movie. This could be a boring movie. This could be Chariots of Fire. And it is a slow-paced movie, but I don't find any second of it boring.
Yeah.
My interest is constantly held throughout the film.
Yeah, because it's so clear, what it's talking about. And it's so clear how important every single piece of dialogue, every single decision being made is so personally important. Again, it's kind of like that thing where Sylvester Stallone has the actual motivation of the character as he's performing it. And it's the same thing with Brady. It's, we're seeing him, I didn't actually look this up, but I assume that we actually see him tame like 3 or 4 horses in the movie. And it's kind of incredible to watch.
He is a high quality horse tamer.
Yeah. And so there's that element that can still fulfill, that drive that he has, and yet in a more quote unquote responsible way. And I think that's one of the most interesting things is that the film ultimately gets to this idea of identity. And I kind of want to extrapolate this into our overall section in a second, but the contrast that gets brought up and it gets really driven home towards the end of the film, starting with the Apollo scene, which sucks. But it's this idea of, like you said, is life worth living without this driving passion for writing in this case? And the film presents the answer that yes, there are other elements of life that are still worth living. And so the way that it brings this all up is so subtle because we see how important he is in his sister's life. We see how good he is at horse taming and things other than rodeo. We see how important he is just to Lane, just to be there for Lane. And all of these things that add up. And yet when he has this one driving passion, he feels like all those other things kind of pale in comparison. And that's the journey that he has to go through, is realizing that, those other things are important. Those other things are worth living. And the way that they show him with the pistol throughout the film as kind of a foreshadowing, and yet you're not totally sure what it's foreshadowing, is so subtle and so good and ominous. There's just so many like little things in this film that all add up to just create this experience like you were talking about. Like you just feel like you're in Brady's head the whole time.
I don't know. It's almost hard to describe it. A lot of it is just, good direction, good acting. Mm-hmm. Even though it's just naturalistic, non-actors doing the acting, it's good acting. Good editing. The whole story just has the whole thing kind of just has this instinct of how to tell a story and when to move from point A to point B, which is something that's super important with slice of life stuff or anything that's going to move a little slower. Especially because a plot is obviously really appealing. It can be super fun, but in a lot of ways, we rely on it wholeheartedly to move stories along. Mm-hmm. That's not the only way. It's just the most common way. And you kind of know what to do with the plot in order to get stuff to move forward. But when you're relying on scenes built out of slice of life, it can be hard to know when to stop, when to start, when to move on, when to change. It's definitely a much more subtle, but super impressive form of filmmaking. Yeah.
Any other specifics about the writer before we move on to overall?
No, I think we should move to overall notes.
All right. So yeah, along those lines, I feel like when we're talking about, so in the first episode of our little mini series, we were talking about team sports and how working together towards a goal makes each person better, and the goal is the most important thing. But individual sports, and I think that's why it's kind of useful to even have this distinction in terms of when we're looking at the films, is that individual sports are so tied to like a person's identity and what are you willing to give up? What are you not willing to give up for this one thing that that sets up your identity? And how does that influence the other areas of your life? And we see that in all the films. We see that in Rocky, where the boxing is part of his, what makes him feel important, and yet he still has to go on this journey to feel like he's up to fighting the best. And in Chariots of Fire, it's about the sport as it comes into conflict with other other values that you hold, and in The Rider, as it comes into conflict with just like literal physical safety and how your personal well-being affects the people around you and that kind of thing, which I think actually some of the later Rocky movies get into that too. Although if
all I know is that there's a robot in one of the later Rocky movies.
Is there really?
Yes, no, it's like it's one of the ones that came out in like the 80s. There's like this really weird like robot servant in one of them.
That he fights, or that is just in the movie?
No, it's just there. The series definitely jumps a shark at some point. I just can't tell you where because I haven't watched them all.
I was going to say, like, robot boxing is straight out of a Rod Serling script. But anyway, I think that the element of identity is one of the things that ties all these movies together.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things I really like about this collection of movies versus the team sports is that these have all like totally skewed towards character study, which makes sense. Like individual sports is one of the this is super ideal. I absolutely love this idea of a relatable event or category of people, individual sports and individual athletes in real life that is just so perfectly set up for character study.
Yeah.
It's super dope. I absolutely love it. I absolutely love the character studies. I like character studies in general, especially ones that are done well, because characters are difficult, and when they're done well, they're super important. Because humans are weird and hard to understand and typically contradict themselves. And trying to convey that over the course of a story, we're trying to focus over on 50 people on a football team can be really hard. Oftentimes you end up with a lot of people who are really kind of one-dimensional. And then some people who are two-dimensional, and maybe one or two end up being three-dimensional with a lot of plot thrown in there and a lot of theme, which isn't bad. But my preferred personal enjoyment of movies tends to skew towards the more individualized, complex character studies. And individual sports, that's where it's at.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, like we harped on this a lot in the team sports episode, but I think it's for the reason you just laid out. It almost doesn't need to be said that these movies don't really depend on your personal preference of watching a particular sport, because you're really watching people and you're watching people's decisions rather than like enjoying the sport for the sport's own sake. And then the last episode of this little mini series that we're going to do later on in the season, we're going to talk about some documentaries, which will be a lot about watching the sport itself and getting enjoyment out of that and how the sport actually played out. But it's a lot more accessible, like you said with Rocky, just because it's about people and it's about, very relatable kinds of people who, may be able to do some things that the average person can't do, but they face the same kind of struggles that we all face in various aspects and in whatever our talents are, because everyone has stuff that they're good at. And yet sometimes the stuff that we're good at doesn't always line up with the things that are the best for us to be doing with our time and our life, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I actually came away adoring two of these movies. I really liked Rocky.
It's hard not to.
I really like The Rider. It's super good. I highly recommend that one. I think that's going to be a hard one for anyone to not like.
Yeah. I think I think it had like a moment when it came out in 2017, but I really don't want it to fade. I think more people need to watch it.
Yeah, well, that's just the problem with the
indie circuit
types of movies that get attention now in the industry. But that's not the discussion for today. And then, of course, I was disappointed in Chariots of Fire, but I understand what it was going for when it was at its most artistic. Yeah. And, of course, I understand why it is the way it is, being an Oscar baity movie from 1981.
And again, like The Rider being such, like, it's so quintessentially American, but American West. And then Rocky being so American, but like American Dream, kind of very Northern. They're so different, and yet they're so American.
Yeah. Lots of similarities between all sorts of people when you get down to it.
Yep.
All freaking weird. But anyway, all right, Jonathan. So what are we going to talk about next week on the podcast?
Yeah, so next week we're going foreign again. we're going to talk about some Taiwanese new wave films, which I'm very excited to get into. I think we talked about like one Taiwanese. I think we talked about A Touch of Zen. Is that the only Taiwanese film we've done? Or did we do a whole King Hu episode?
We definitely did more King Hu. I don't think we did a full King Hu episode.
Oh no, we did a Wuxia episode in which we covered Dragon Inn or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, we haven't done very much Taiwanese film, so
yeah.
we're gonna talk about A City of Sadness from 1989, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman from 1995, and then Yi Yi from 2000.
They're all such good movies. They're all very slice of lifey too. So get ready for more of that.
Yeah. Are two of these Edward Yang or just one?
I believe only Yi Yi's Edward Yang.
Oh, okay. But yeah, we're definitely going to talk about Edward Yang next time a lot.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, he's got some really good movies out there.
But yeah, before we go, if you would like to support the podcast, we do have a Patreon, so you can head over there and join our digital community on Discord, where we live stream the podcast, and we sometimes have Netflix parties and just chat about film and that kind of thing. And we also have a bonus podcast on the Patreon. And the last time we talked about an indie movie called First Cow. This does not have anything to do with the rodeo. But you could go over there and check that out to see what we talked about with First Cow, which is recently available to rent online.
All right, Jonathan, that's about all the time we have for today's episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994. Hey, yo, Adrian.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Jason, take it away.
Jason sings, "Getting Stronger."
If you asked him to sing everything, he would.
He would.